Hello and welcome to another part of my Repairathon. First of all, I'm sorry that it takes so much time to release the videos. I'm currently very busy at my daily job due to some critical deadlines, and I simply don't have enough spare time to finish the repairs and to cut the videos. Anyhow, today I have an interesting one. One of the main boards which I bought for this Repairathon was this Asus P2B. It was the best of its time. In the initial video to this Repairathon, I removed some parts from it and washed together with other boards. Now it is ready for a closer look. It is a slot 1 mainboard based on the glorious Intel 440BX chipset. The board seems to be in a good overall shape. The clips on the SD-RAM slots are all intact. The board seems to have some bent jumper pins, but it's not a problem. Those can be straightened using a pair of tweezers or a screwdriver or such a tool which I already showed a couple of times in my videos. This tool was part of a set which I bought together with a cheap soldering iron some years ago. Meanwhile, I rarely use that soldering iron, but the tools are still coming handy. As you see, most of the pins look good again, but I have to go through all of them since there are still some bent pins, like the fan connector here. Well, this is a slot 1 mainboard, as I already said, and it was designed for the Pentium II back in the days, hence the name P2B, where P2 stands for Pentium II and the B probably for the BX chipset. The capacitors do still look good, but they still could be electrically bad, we will see. The CPU slot seems to be also alright, I don't see any bent pins in it, but speaking of slots, as I washed the board, I noticed a bent pin inside of the ISO slot. It looks a little bit twisted, but it seems not to have any contact to another pins. That's good, and I think I'll be able to straighten these pins later with a pair of tweezers. I would like not to have to change the whole slot because of that. Now look at the BIOS dip socket. It is broken in the middle. I guess somebody was trying to remove the IC with a lot of force, probably by inserting the screwdriver between the PCB and the socket, instead of between the socket and the IC. That probably broke the socket in two. At least as far as I can see, the PCB was not damaged, but I will definitely know it when I remove the socket. So, on the back I don't see anything critical so far. There are some minor scratches, but they are only on the surface and seem not to affect any traces. One quite annoying issue which I already ran into a couple of times are bent pins of the parts on the back of the PCB, like these ones. It could happen that they scratch the soldering mask of the copper traces and get in contact with them. Sometimes a very slight contact, which could lead to sporadic and very hard to track issues. So it's better to straighten them or even cut them off if they are too long. So, the board looks okay so far. I will have to exchange the BIOS dip socket and straighten some more pins. The capacitors in the CPU power supply circuit look good. The infamous capacitors plug started with more power-hungry AMD Athlon and Intel Pentium IV CPUs. But on the early Pentium II mainboards, that wasn't as much of an issue. At least not as often as on the later system. Maybe I'll desolder one or two caps to make a test and will decide later if they have to be replaced. Before soldering, always add some fresh solder. That makes the whole procedure much easier. The fact that the deep socket is broken in two makes it even easier to desolder it. If you don't plan to keep the socket, just cut it with pliers. This way you can wiggle one row independent from the other one and see which pins are still soldered. In this case, as you probably see, all the pins are moving except of one. And here we go, one half has been removed, another one to go. The area under the socket looks fine, so luckily the PCB was not damaged, as the socket was violently broken and I just have to install another one. Now I need the BIOS ROM image and, just as always, the Retro web project, previously known under the name Ultimate Retro, can help with that. The Asus P2B was released in various revisions. The board I have here is revision 1.02, and there are plenty of different BIOS versions available for download. I got the latest one and have written it using my TL866 programmer to a flash chip. Okay, time to set the jumpers. The accordant pins are now straightened again, but all the jumpers were stolen. This board supports FSB up to 133 MHz, but I will start low and go with moderate 66 MHz. For the CPU, which I usually use to test slot 1 mainboards, the clock multiplier doesn't play a role, because the CPU has a locked multiplier anyway, but if everything goes well, I'll also test one Pentium II 233 with unlocked multiplier, which I have in my workshop. That CPU runs at 66 MHz frontside bus and needs a multiplier of 3.5. Other CPUs will ignore these settings anyway. And this is my test, Celeron 433 MHz. If you watch my channel regularly, you probably saw it in one of my other videos already. Let's add a postcode analyzer card and see if there is some life in this old board. Okay, C0 code. The good news is that there is a postcode at all. This means that the CPU is alive. The bad news is that nothing else is happening. The board has yet no memory modules installed, but still we should see some more postcodes. Let's add some memory and see if something changes. Nope, still the same C0, and this PC speaker is also silent. No beeping, no complaining, nothing. Okay, first of all, let's see if the CPU gets the voltage it needs. The Celeron 433 needs 2 volts. Here we have 5 volt regulator input, and here it should be regulated down to 2 volts. And we are getting exactly 2 volts. So the CPU gets powered properly. There has to be something else. Okay, first of all, let's exclude one possible reason. I already had some mainboards in my hands which didn't want to boot without the CMOS battery at all. So let's add a battery and see if it changes anything. Well, the situation has changed slightly. Now we get to the next postcode and have C1, C0. On the left we always have the latest code and on the right the previous one. However, it didn't go any further and the PC speaker is still silent as well. Let's add some dioxide into the memory and the CPU slots. Funny, now we have just C0 again, and let's replace the memory module. They are equal and I know that they both were definitely working, but maybe one of them got defective. And there are some beep codes. So the other module could be defective indeed. Let's swap the modules again and see if we can reproduce that. Magic! Now this memory module works too. Very strange. I'll add both modules to see if it would work too. And it does. What the heck happens here? Okay, let's add a graphics card, connect the keyboard and see if it is possible to reach the BIOS settings. This is a partial success. There is an image, but the PC speaker is beeping like crazy and the system tells that there is a keyboard error. It seems also not to react to the input. Okay, I checked once again everything. CPU and RAM are sitting well, and all of the jumpers I said so far are correct as well. However, looking through the manual I realized that I overlooked the keyboard power-up jumper, which is located near the ATX power connector. This jumper allows to disable or enable the keyboard power-up function and has to be set either to enable or disable explicitly and is usually not allowed to stay floating. And this jumper is hiding behind the power cable and so very easy to overlook. Let's set the jumper properly and try once again. And there is no beeping and no keyboard error anymore. And luckily I even can reach the BIOS. Okay, the system is trying to boot from the drives, but currently neither hard drive nor floppy are connected. Interesting is that the board complains about ESCD write operation during the DMI update. What is it? In short, DMI stands for Desktop Management Interface and is used for hardware components tracking. Every time you move a PCI card from one slot to another or replace some hardware, DMI comes into play, which uses Extended System Configuration Data, or short ESCD, to store resources like IRQs. This is basically what we call plug and play. The ESCD is written into the flash IC, where BIOS is stored as well. I took the first IC, which fits from the capacity for the BIOS, but actually not every flash or EEPROM IC works in every board. They can have the same pinout when talking about reading, but different electrical parameters for writing, different amount of write cycles, etc. For example, the 27SF020, which I took, allows only 1000 write cycles, but for example 29EE020 allows up to 100,000 write cycles, which is more appropriate since 1000 cycles can be reached fast when changing the hardware often. Remember that writing the ESCD information into the flash happens every time the hardware configuration changes, but this is not everything that is different between those ICs. The 29EE020 has the pin 1 not connected, where on the 27SF020 there is VPP on pin 1, which is power supply for write or erase operation and often needs 12 volts. On the 29EE020, VPP is generated internally and doesn't need additional voltage at all. Long story short, even if both ICs behave in the same way when reading, there is a lot of difference when they have to be written, so pay attention to use the right IC for the BIOS. Should you get the ESCD write error, probably either your IC reached the write cycles limit or is simply a wrong one, like it was in this case. Now let me also add a compact flash to IDE adapter with Microsoft DOS on it and see if this system will be able to boot into the operation system. Yeah, the BIOS is initialized and the compact flash card is detected. Update ESCD successfully. That means that the BIOS IC is now the right one. And the system is even booting into DOS. System information doesn't detect the CPU properly, but the benchmark is skyrocketing over 1000 points. CPU identification utility detects the CPU properly on the other hand. Just as I often do, my first benchmark of choice is Doom. It is still a gem of game development and I absolutely love this game. I don't think that I played through any other game in my life as often as Doom, really. And to no surprise, it runs perfectly on this machine. No wonder, it is 3 generations newer than what was meant to be the best to run this game. And it finishes the run with 889 points, which corresponds to around 84 FPS. An acceptable value so far, but this board is by far more capable than this. Let's talk about this CPU. This is my CPU of choice, which I use to test slot 1 mainboards. It is a Celeron 433, it runs with 66 MHz frontside bus, remains quite cool and can even run without a cooler at all for a minute or two. What is really nice for short tests and measurements. And this CPU needs 2 volts power, which almost every slot 1 mainboard can provide out of the box. Let's put it back for a second and take a look once again at the CPU voltage. As you see, perfect 2 volts. This Celeron is actually a socket 370 CPU, but can be used through a slot 1 adapter in this board. Now let's take a look at another CPU, which is slightly older. Pentium II 233. This CPU runs with 66 MHz frontside bus, just as the Celeron before, but unlike Celeron, this Pentium II has unlocked frontside bus multiplier and could be overclocked. Previously, I already set the jumpers accordingly, which the Celeron silently ignored, but this CPU will respect the jumpers and should run at default 233 MHz. Okay, there are already some post beeps, means the CPU is running, but what I would like to show you is the CPU voltage. It is at 2.8 volts, as you hopefully see. So, the slot 1 mainboards provide the voltage to the CPU automatically. The slot 1 specification allows the CPU to tell the mainboard which voltage that one has to provide, and you don't need to set up any jumpers on the board like it was previously on the Socket 7 and earlier platforms. Okay, so what's the point? So far I showed you one 433 MHz Celeron and one 233 MHz Pentium II CPUs. They are nice, but not super exciting on this mainboard. Here I have an Intel Pentium III CPU, which can run at 133 MHz frontside bus at fixed multiplier of 6.5 and total frequency at 866 MHz. Sounds more interesting, isn't it? It is a copper-mined CPU, which is more power efficient than the previous models, and it needs only 1.7 volts. Let's try this one and see what happens. Well, as you see, there are 0 volts on the CPU. No beeps, no postcodes whatsoever. As you see, the mainboard gets powered, but the CPU seems not to get the required voltage and remains cold. The problem is the mainboard, or better to say the date of release of this mainboard. As I said, it is called P2B, where P2 probably stands for Pentium II. You see, the earlier revisions of this mainboard were released as Pentium II was a new kid on the block. With its 2.8 volts, which the CPU required, it was far away from the 1.7 volts which the copper-mined Pentium III CPUs needed years later. Looking into its glass ball, Asus designed this board with a voltage regulator which could regulate the CPU voltage only down to 1.8 volts, and as soon as a CPU requested 1.7 volts, the voltage regulator on the mainboard said nope and refused to work. Later revisions of this board got an upgrade, and starting with revision 1.10, they also started to support even lower voltages. But I have here a revision 1.02, so what can be done to convince this board to work with the CPU? Unfortunately, nothing. Well, at least not without modifying the CPU, and I don't want to do that. However, this is not the end of the story. As I already said, I used a Socket 370 Celeron CPU in such a slot cat adapter. Slot plus sockets makes slotcat, is more or less the official name of it. And there are plenty of different such adapters out there. They can be so different that I could actually fill a whole video talking only about those adapters. Some are very simple and don't support higher frontside bus and lower voltages. Others are quite flexible and support not only higher frontside bus and lower voltages, but even 2-Latin Pentium III CPUs with up to 1.4 GHz. An absolute beast of a machine from the days. Well, I don't have slotcat adapter which would support 2-Latin. I know that an adapter can also be modified to support it, but I prefer not to. Instead, I have a couple of copper-mined Pentium III 1 GHz CPUs, and it would be nice if one of them would run in that Asus P2B mainboard. It also needs 1.7 volts, and would I simply drop it into this adapter, then it wouldn't work in this board, just as the slot 1 Pentium III 866 didn't work before. So, here are all the adapters I have in my workshop. The green one is very simple and has no jumpers. This one has some jumpers to select the frontside bus and the type of the CPU. Intel Pentium, Intel Celeron or even Cyrix. Not much else can be said here, and without going into details, it is more or less just as simple as the green one, which I used with my Celeron CPU. Well, now things are getting interesting. This slot cat adapter has some more jumpers, and they can be used to override the voltage settings of the CPU. On the back here is a table, and as you see, you can set the jumpers all the way down to 1.3 volts. If all the jumpers are set to 1.2, then the adapter will just pass through the CPU signaling to the slot 1 and let the CPU decide which voltage to request. Important is that this adapter doesn't convert any voltage. It is only about signaling and telling the mainboard which voltage it has to deliver. The conversion still happens on the mainboard itself. So, let's insert the CPU into the socket first. As you see, once again, the CPU needs 1.7 volts, but this mainboard is not able to provide such a low voltage. However, this slot cat adapter can be used to override the voltage and go, for example, with 1.8 volts instead. That would overvolt the CPU slightly, but 0.1 volts wouldn't be all that critical. Let's set the jumpers accordingly and see if the mainboard will be able to deliver 1.8 volts. Aha, there are some beep codes. That means that the CPU gets powered. Let's briefly check the voltage. Exactly 1.8 volts. Superb! Okay, let's reinstall the graphics card and the compact flash to IDE adapter and try to boot into DOS. Okay, the system posts, the CPU gets initialized, and the BIOS seems even to recognize properly that it is a Pentium III. But it tells that it is only 500 MHz one. In fact, we have here a 1 GHz CPU. This is due to the wrong frontside bus settings, which are still at 66 MHz. Let me set them to 133 MHz now. And would you look at that, Pentium III 1000 MHz detected. Perfect! As you see, CPU identification utility detects this CPU properly as well. It is a 999.8 MHz Pentium III with 133 MHz frontside bus and 7.5 multiplier. Okay, let's run Doom once again. .467 points or 160 FPS. That is almost twice as fast as before, but to be honest, the values are actually far from a record. Since I didn't any tweaking in BIOS, nor is it the fastest graphics card, so don't take it as a reference. There are also some tools like FastVid, which would probably get another 100% increase in performance on the system. But, well, maybe a good topic for another video. In 320 by 200 in Quake, we are getting 103 FPS. But also here, I guess that a lot of better performance can be gained with proper tweaking. But this video got already quite long, and if you remember, it started with a repair. So I'm very glad to say that this gorgeous Asus P2B is being raised back from the dead and will hopefully serve as a nice platform for a retro PC. This board supports 133 MHz frontside bus, and with a little bit of overall voltage and proper slot cat adapter, it even can get up to 1 GHz. One thing which I have to mention, however, is the power draw. Since this board was not designed to run with Pentium III CPUs, using such a CPU could potentially pull too much power from the circuit. Let's see, the most power-hungry Pentium II, known under the codename Klamath, has at 300 MHz a TDP of up to 43 watts at 2.8 volts. Means that it could pull up to 15.4 amps. The Coppermine Pentium III is much more power efficient and has at 1 GHz a TDP of only 29 watts at 1.75 volts. This means that it draws with 16.6 amps at much higher frequency, only about 1 amp more than the Klamath Pentium II. That could be a problem, but I'm pretty sure that Asus designed this board with a big safety margin, so it should easily stand that additional 1 amp of current. I will play a little bit with BIOS settings, tools and other graphics cards to try to squeeze some more performance out of this board later. And if it will be interesting, I'll share my results in another video. Sorry once again that I released the videos with such a huge delay recently, but currently I'm just too busy to find some spare time for the hobby. However, I don't plan to stop doing it anytime soon, and if you don't want to miss the next video, don't forget to subscribe. And I hope to see you on my channel again. Thank you for watching and goodbye.